The Novation circuit rhythm and Polyend tracker at their cores are actually pretty damn similar. But there is a price difference there, and more importantly, a user experience difference, which I'll get into and demonstrate over the course of this video. Plus, this was highly requested, so I figured I would go ahead and cover it. So let's get into it. Hands-on comparing the Novation circuit rhythm and Polyend tracker. Let's start off with the similarities. Both of these devices have 8 tracks here, and 8 tracks here. And they are monophonic tracks, so they can only play one sound at a time, but you can switch between multiple sounds on the space of one track. So for instance, just as a bad example, and same deal here, where I have a kick and a bass sharing a same track. And it's just switching between them. Pretty straightforward so far. That's how you're going to get quite a bit more than you might initially anticipate out of both of these devices. It seems like a huge limitation, and to a degree it is, and I'd love to see manufacturers move away from it, but you can get a lot out of these devices. And this is kind of a hallmark of the tracker style anyway, and it forces you to think a bit differently about making music. I should also mention that on both devices you can even switch between sounds while a melody is going. Let's just use this as an example. So let me assign those. Horrible example. And on this, that will work a little bit differently because the note being played and the instrument being used, aka the sample being used, are shown in the same window, which has some workflow ramifications that I'll get into in a bit. But regardless, both of these devices are step-based. So watch the playhead go through. Give it a click. And same deal here, except these steps run vertical. That's the only difference. People tend to think that this is really confusing, and to a newcomer, it absolutely can be. But the thing to remember is that it's just scrolling through each of these steps one by one, and if there's a sound there, it'll play it, and if there isn't a sound there, it won't. It kind of doesn't matter whether it's horizontal or vertical. You can switch this to horizontal view. I don't think it makes that big of a difference once you get your head around exactly what it's doing. The thing that tends to scare people is the fact that this looks like an Excel spreadsheet, but hopefully I can help make this setup make a bit more sense by the end of this video. And I can show you how these are both very similar, but how the subtle differences lead to a huge splitting off of user interface feel. But before I get to that, let's talk about the build of both devices. The circuit rhythm is a bit more portable than the tracker because the rhythm has an internal battery. Now, it's a rechargeable battery that only lasts for about 4 hours, so your mileage may vary with that, but I've actually never really run into huge limitations with the battery life. It's always been enough. And it's fairly light, whereas the tracker is a little bit heftier, it's slightly thinner, and it has a slightly bigger footprint, but it's also super portable, and I would feel slightly more comfortable putting the tracker in a backpack than I would the circuit rhythm, just because the circuit rhythm has this kind of tapered shape and the knobs sticking out more. The tracker does have to be powered by an external source, but that power source can be just a regular phone charger power bank. That's plenty to get it to work portably, which is really not bad. And of course, the tracker has a screen. The circuit rhythm does not. In the circuit rhythm's case, the pads are the screen, and a lot of people who have been using grooveboxes for a while end up preferring that. And note that this is not a touchscreen, although it doesn't necessarily need to be. I kind of like the old school vibe that this goes for, and that's the thing to keep in mind, is that these both go for an old school vibe and achieve it in different ways, but the tracker definitely feels nerdier and more like 90s computer interface, which will be appealing to some and will be a total turnoff for others. But while we're on the subject of build quality, let's talk about the pads. And longtime viewers of the channel probably already know what I'm about to say here. The pads on the circuit rhythm are way more responsive than the pads on the Polyend tracker. And of course, they're bigger. I prefer the circuit rhythm pads infinitely more than the tracker's pads, but that is because finger drumming is really important to me. So if I go into drum pad mode, I've got all that control. I can finger drum to my heart's content, and for me, that's super important. For other people, it won't matter as much because these are more buttons than pads. You're not really going to be doing any complicated finger drumming with them. You're going to be pushing them rather than hitting them, if that makes sense. These little pads break my heart, honestly, but they're serviceable if you just get over the fact that you're not really going to be finger drumming on these. I do like how bright they are, though. And they are a necessary input device. Just be aware of the fact that they're small and lend even more credence to the feeling that making music on the Polyend tracker is a little closer to programming than playing. So far, it seems like I'm dissing on the tracker in comparison to the rhythm. Let's flip the script on that a little bit, because that is not the case. The Polyend tracker works with samples in a few ways that beat the circuit rhythm pretty handily. First of all, in terms of sample loading, the circuit rhythm is stuck on the PAX format. So on your computer, you use the component's web interface or software, you load in your sounds, and then you load them in as a pack on the rhythm. And you can only have one pack active at a time, because those are the samples that the rhythm stores in its active memory. That can be a little bit limiting. Yes, you can record samples directly into the rhythm, so if you get bored with the pack that you're in and just want to add a few extra sounds, you can just do that. But if you're on the go, you're probably not going to be doing that. So you're just going to be limited to the packs that you've already loaded in if you're using the circuit rhythm completely by itself with absolutely nothing else. And you can load a decent amount of sounds in, but there is a pretty constricting time limit. Whereas on the Polyend tracker, you don't have to deal with any sort of web interface. Literally, all you have to do is take out the micro SD card, drag samples onto it, and you can sort them into folders if you want. That's all you have to do. So here in Sample Loader, you can go to your samples, and then you just have all your folders full of samples. You can load them in, you can audition them, and you can even see how much memory they're taking up. So you can make sure that you're not loading too much in, and you can only load in what you think you might need. And it's got enough space to have quite a few samples on a project-by-project basis. However, the one thing I will say in defense of the Circuit Rhythms packs is that it reduces friction, because I've got all these sounds loaded in. They're all ready to go. I don't have to do anything to load them in, I just select them. So assuming I either made some packs for myself that are well tailored to specific genres, or I made some packs that have a good amount of variety in them, I can just pick this thing up, turn it on, and go. Whereas with this, if I'm starting something new, I do have to go in and kind of select my samples before getting into making music. And if I'm just sitting down to casually bang out a little doodle, that does get in my way a tiny bit. There are some other major upgrades that the tracker introduces in terms of working with samples over the circuit rhythm, but I'm going to get into that in a second because I promised I would talk about workflow, and now seems as good a time as any to get into it. So both devices feature live recording, which I'll show you in a second, but let's start off with programming, because that shows the kind of key difference in workflow that these things introduce. So on the circuit rhythm, you've got your sequencer up here and your sound selection down here. Much like on this, you've got your sequencer here, and you've got your sound selection down here. Pretty similar so far. You've got your steps here, you've got your steps here. Once again, so far, so similar. But here's the first difference. If I want to program, say, a 4-on-the-floor kick onto my circuit rhythm, all I have to do is hold down the sample and then select the steps that I want to put it on. Or I can get rid of those, or I could hold down the step and select the sample. That works too. And both are side by side, and you don't have to scroll to anything. It's all just right there for you, which I find super intuitive. However, if you want to do keyboard stuff, you have to switch to the keyboard view. And then once again, you can start dropping in notes. Hopefully you get the idea. And of course, you can switch between samples, once again by holding down samples. And you can get rid of them just as easily. That, in my opinion, is about as quick and intuitive and hands-on as it gets. On the circuit rhythm, if you want to put a note in, it's basically as quick as thinking of it and then just doing it. So I've got some 4-on-the-floor kick stuff going on here. Let me turn the tempo up a bit. See, here's the pads of the screen approach. And for live recording, it's a terrible sample, but I can switch it out. And once again, I can pull up my notes and I can do live recording there too. And I can chain multiple patterns together to increase the length of the amount of time I can record. I can also double the length of an individual pattern. Let me clear these for now, though. On the tracker, patterns work a little bit more like song sections rather than individual patterns that are separated out by tracks. So that's something to keep in mind. This is a little more Ableton style. This is a little more MPC style in the way it deals with patterns. But for actually programming stuff in, I'm going to hit the record button. And then there are a few things I can do. If I start scrolling, it'll pull up the ability to scroll through samples. And let's say I want to use that clap, but have it be at a different pitch. I can switch to note, and I can program stuff that way. Or I can just delete something, or I can move between steps. You may notice that's a little bit less immediate than just selecting a step and immediately dropping something onto it. But the advantage is that, for one thing, you can see the note and the sample at the same time on every single track. And from what I understand, I've selected instrument again, by the way, so I'm just going to put in a 4 on the floor kick. From what I understand, people get pretty fast with this workflow, and you can even fill in steps at regular intervals automatically. So then I can scroll to individual notes, I can hit record to be able to modify them and then scroll up and down this way, and I can add other stuff. Whoops. See that? I did not mean to do. Hopefully you get the idea. It takes some getting used to, for sure. But from what I understand, people can get really fast at it. So I will take their word for it. I have not yet. I would probably prefer to record something in live in this situation. But you'll notice so far I've only covered these first 2 little mini columns. There are 2 more. So in the same way that you can see which sample you have selected and what note it's on at the same time, you can also see effects, which are things like note repeats. So let me hit record, select effects 1, hold it down to select one of these. So then I can start selecting things like the volume of an individual step, or micromove to scoot it back and forth a little bit, even some random stuff if you want to get into some more chaos, which this thing is great for, filters, all that kind of stuff, even CC values, all in here, all on one screen, which, you know what, that's pretty nice. In this case, just for the sake of obviousness, let's choose a roll, and then you can even audition the amount that it's going to roll it. It's a bit much. Whereas on here, I have to go into a different window to see on a step-by-step basis where my note repeats are. Which, because I have the sequencer here, is totally fine by me. I still find the circuit rhythm faster, but it is something that these devices approach differently, and you might prefer seeing all of your step-by-step parameters on one screen rather than separated by different windows. Personal preference, probably. Once again, I prefer selecting steps and selecting notes, or vice versa, for the tracker star workflow. I like that a lot better than having to scroll around and remember which samples are which and exactly what my step-by-step settings are. It's different approaches, and this feels a little more mechanical, and you have to be a bit more methodical with it, or else you're going to be finding yourself scrolling back and forth with these arrows and this knob a lot. I should also mention, you can preview your steps, which is nice. That does cut down on the trial and error quite a bit. Up next, though, let's talk about shaping your sounds. And there's some overlap. For instance, you've got control of pitch on both devices, whether in the form of a knob or in the form of a note. You've got access to that on both. So I'm gonna go to instrument parameters, and you've got tune. Here, exact same thing. And there's a little fine tune option as well, which is what you get if you do not hold down shift while turning the tune button on the circuit. You've also got volume stuff, panning stuff, obviously. There's a dedicated mixer window on both, but in the tracker, you've got 2 levels of mixer, which can come in clutch. You've also got controls over your note length. And on the circuit rhythm, you've got some basic envelopes. Whereas on the tracker, the envelopes are far superior, and it's not even close. So I'm gonna go to another window of instrument parameters, and I've got my volume envelope. And I've got full ADSR, which is so nice to have for manipulating samples. Like, the Digitact has it, this has it. I really wish the circuit rhythm had full ADSR. And that becomes even more important when we start getting into the filters. Because on the circuit rhythm, you have high and low cut filters, but no envelopes to go with them. You have to automate them or resample automation of them to get filter envelopes. That's a huge limitation, and it's a bummer. You also have resonance, by the way, which can scream, which is neat. But on the tracker, I've got a choice of low pass, high pass, or band pass. Let's do a low pass. Turn the resonance up, just so you can hear the pronounced effect that this is going to have. And it's got an envelope or an LFO to it. Once again, that goes a long way for manipulating a sample. So now, you can hear that filter sweep downwards. because of the envelope. And you can even control the amount. So that kicks the circuit's ass right there. And of course, there's also the LFO. In this case, I have it set towards the cutoff as well. And you've got quite a bit of control, including the random stuff, which can be fun for some more kind of steppy, generative-ish patches. And speaking of patches, you've also got granular and wavetable synth engines on the Polyend tracker, which the circuit does not have. The circuit could do some sort of granular stuff because you could loop a sample and have a really short segment of it, but that's not nearly as in-depth, not even the same universe as the granular and or wavetable engines of this thing. So now I can control the position. And the shape. And you can even modulate the position and stuff like that with an LFO as well. So that's granular, and you can convert your sample to a wavetable as well. And use that either scrolling through it, and you can even smooth out the steps in your wavetable. There's an algorithm on here to do that. Or you could just park it on, say, one single cycle waveform and use that as the basis of your sound, and then shape it with filters and processing, which is super cool to have on a device like this, and the circuit just can't compete on that level because it just doesn't have a wavetable or granular engine. I did a dedicated video exploring the granular and wavetable engines of the Polyend tracker that I'll link at the end of this video if you want to see more about it. But let's move on to effects, because one sample by sample effect that the circuit rhythm has is a distortion that I quite like. It's clean, but absolutely nasty. And there's also a distortion, or overdrive, on the tracker, which is also quite good. However, what it adds is a bit crusher. The circuit could have used that. And on both devices, the reverb and delay operate on sense. And you'll notice that's a bit more stepped on the circuit rhythm as well. And there's a delay as well on both. And you've got control over the individual parameters of both, but probably a bit more on the tracker than on the circuit. Once again, stuff on the tracker gets a little more in-depth, stuff on the circuit rhythm gets a little more speed in terms of the workflow. That's kind of the running theme here. One aspect of processing that the circuit wins on, though, in my opinion, is sidechaining. On the circuit rhythm, you can have different tracks sidechaining other tracks, and you get pretty responsive sidechains. Let me get rid of these effects. So on the circuit rhythm, I've just recorded in something super basic. I can just go to my sidechain. I can select what the source of the sidechain is on a track-by-track basis, and I can select the extremity of the sidechain, and it only affects the tracks that I've selected. So for instance, and it's really clean sounding. Perfect for modern electronic music and hip-hop. Not quite the case on the Polyend tracker. The limiter is how the sidechain works. So you choose one track to be the source of the sidechain. So let's say track 1. And then you bring down the limiter threshold, and it will sidechain everything else using the master limiter to that one track. And it doesn't sound great, in my opinion. And moreover, it just doesn't give you the amount of control that the circuit does, where every single track has its individual sidechain controls. That sounds cleaner. So, sorry tracker, the circuit does have you beat on that one. However, of course, you're free to ignore the built-in sidechain on the tracker if you don't intend on using it for live purposes and instead intend on using it for the studio, because you can directly export the individual tracks of the Polyend tracker as WAV files and then bring them into the DAW, digital audio workstation, of your choice and do all your sidechain and a bunch of extra processing there. The circuit rhythm has no individual track export options. It just doesn't, which is a huge bummer. If you want to get your individual tracks, you have to like mute and unmute tracks as you go and record them that way, which, to be fair, it's not a huge pain, but I never find myself doing it. Whereas with the tracker, that's pretty much my go-to, is I'll make something on here and then I'll export those tracks and work with them afterwards because it's just super painless to do. And finally, one other effects thing are these grid effects. The Circuit Rhythm has them, Polyend Tracker doesn't. They're kind of a gimmick though, so in my mind, personally, that's not even close to a deal breaker. If you'd like to see a few more videos showing both devices in action, I've got you covered. You can click or tap up over here, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching.